Welcome back to the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf YouTube channel. Today, we continue our reading of Meditation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Geoffrey DeGraff. We deeply value your support. Please like and share this audiobook to reach a wider audience, allowing more people to benefit from its wisdom. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, ensuring you receive immediate notifications as we upload new content. Together, we can spread the teachings of meditation and mindfulness, fostering a community of enlightenment and inner peace. Thank you for being part of our journey to make these profound teachings accessible to all. Let's start today with reading When Things Aren't Going Well. November 14, 2008. Some of the discourses give an impression that the practice is a smooth upward incline, one sure-footed step after another, going progressively up and up and up a staircase. Fortunately, the canon contains other passages confirming that it's not always a steady progress. There are ups and downs. Some of the passages, especially in the Therigatha and Therigatha, portray monks and nuns complaining that the practice would go well for a while and then crash, go well for a while then crash. One monk commenting that this had happened so often that he was ready to commit suicide, it had gotten so bad. Those passages are good reminders that no matter how bad things get, it's still possible to gain awakening. In each of these cases where the monks and the nuns had run amok from their dwellings, crazed over the ups and downs of their practice, they now pulled themselves together and were able to attain total release. This is why it's good to look to these stories for encouragement. Back in the 19th century, people liked to read the lives of great men and women. It was considered an essential part of a good education to study their examples. How they'd been through many, many hardships and yet hadn't lost heart, how they'd now come out on top. With modern literature, the taste has changed to anti-heroes, people you may sympathize with, but who you wouldn't want to take as examples. It's a shame that we've lost a taste for genuine heroes and heroines in our literature. Occasionally you envy it, though, as in the accounts of the most recent political campaigns. Even the most well-oiled campaign machine would have its ups and downs, but what mattered was how the people in charge managed those ups and downs. One of the important lessons you can learn from these accounts is that when things get bad, it's not the end of the world. You just stop, take stock of the situation, and go a way out. Or you can read about expeditions like Shackleton's down to Antarctica. Things got really bad even before they could get to Antarctica. Their ship got locked at sea in the winter ice, so they had to leave the ship and walk across the ice, dragging their dinghies behind them. When they reached the edge of the ice, they set out across the ocean. Most of them thought they were doomed. But even when they thought they were doomed, they kept going because of one thing: their sense of discipline, realizing that as long as you stay disciplined, you can take advantage of whatever opportunities do arise. That's the RST lesson to take from these stories. A strong sense of discipline. As you dig down into this lesson, it reminds you that you need to get back to basics so that the consistency of your discipline has a RM foundation. In our practice, getting back to basics means reminding yourself of why you're here. You're soaring and this is the way out. What is that way out? As the Buddha says, right view comes RST. In his analysis of dependent co-arising, the prime factor causing soaring is ignorance. You don't see things in terms of the Four Noble Truths, and your attention goes wandering to all sorts of other places. Or if you do have little bits and pieces of knowledge, that's all it is. Little bits and pieces. Nothing continuous. You need to develop mindfulness and alertness so that your knowledge becomes more continuous, and the bits and pieces connect up. So consistency and the focus on how to end soaring are two basic principles to bring to your awareness. You're here to gain knowledge by looking at things consistently in terms of the Four Noble Truths. Get started with the right questions. Where is there stress right now? What are you doing to cause it? What actions help to alleviate it? Then bring more consistent attention to those questions and to how they apply to what you're experiencing right now. If it strings you out to focus on the stress, then focus on the question, where are the good things right now? What can you rely on as your path? If there's a little bit of mindfulness, hold on to it. Right speech, right action, all the rights of the noble path. Hold on to what you've got, realizing that the situation inside and out may not be what you like, but your way out of here is to hold on to whatever you still have of the path, these states of mind. Even if all you've got is just that simple ability to stay attentive, then stay attentive and keep that attention appropriate without getting entangled in the storylines, the narratives, and all the other crazy ideas that the mind keeps churning out for itself. So when things don't look good, try to get some perspective by reminding yourself, what are the basics? Why are you here? What is this all about? It's about developing some skills and learning how to comprehend your stress and suffering, learning how to abandon the cause when you can see it, learning how to develop the good factors of the path, and whatever other qualities of mind reinforce the path when they arise. Endurance is important. It's the quality that gives the consistency to the path. Simply following the path 1 hour a night is not going to do the trick. On again. Oh, again. That doesn't help at all. It may help a little, but it doesn't build up the momentum you need. Momentum comes with sticking with things over time. It's like planting a tree. If you plant the tree and water it only occasionally, or water it just once and forget about it, the tree is not going to survive. You have to be consistent in looking after it, committed to looking after it. That's how it grows. Take a lesson from your breathing. The body breathes continually. If it breathed just while you were focusing on it and then stopped breathing when you were thinking about something else, you'd be dead. So take some lessons from the breath because it's consistent. It keeps coming in and going out whether you pay attention to it or not, whether you like it or not. It's there. It keeps coming in and going out, keeping you alive. Take that as a lesson for the mind. You've got to be consistent. Even though the path is not yielding the quick and exciting results you'd like to see, remember that nobody promised it was going to be quick and easy, that it was going to be exciting all along the way. When the practice has its ups, you have to be heedful. When it gets down, you have to be heedful. You can't be complacent either way. In other words, when things are going really well, you can't take your hands off the steering wheel, assuming that the car is going to drive itself. You can't let yourself get complacent or careless. Keep being attentive very, very consistently, moment by moment, to what's happening. If things are going well, do what you can to keep them going well. When things are not going well, again, you can't be heedless. You can't let negativity take over your mind. It'll have lots of things to complain about. This is not the right place to practice. These are not good people to practice with on, diverting your attention from the real problem, which is that you're not paying careful attention to what the mind is doing. The mind is a very clever politician. It can very quickly distract you from what's really going on. This is why the Buddha said to obtain completion through heedfulness, through being very careful, uncomplacent. That's the discipline that will see you through. That expedition that Shackleton ran. I once got into a disagreement with someone who said that Shackleton made all sorts of wrong decisions, so his followers shouldn't have listened to him. But if they hadn't listened to him, the whole thing would have fallen apart. People would have died. He got people through and inspired them to get themselves through even though he did make mistakes. A sense of discipline is what can correct for those mistakes to make sure that they're not disastrous. So always remember, whenever there's a problem, that more attention is required. In particular, you have to pay more careful attention to what's happening in terms of the issue of stress and its causes. Everything you need to know for awakening is right here. All the factors are right here, simply that at the moment they're out of control, they're causing suffering. When you learn how to bring them under control, then this process of fabrication, for example, can turn into the path. Many of the elements of dependent co-arising have the potential to become path factors. Attention, in name and form, can become appropriate attention. Fabrication can become the comfortable breathing and directed thought and evaluation of right concentration. So it's all right here. When you get bored or discouraged with the practice, remind yourself that it's because you're not paying careful attention. You're letting your expectations get in the way, or your moods get in the way. Something is getting in the way so that you're not really seeing what's going on. This combination of focused attention and consistency means that you pay more and more careful attention, appropriate attention to the issues of the Four Noble Truths. The truths are not just truths about something. They're ways of looking, categories you can apply to anything going on in the mind. You can watch all the crazy thoughts in the mind and, if you do it from the perspective of the Four Noble Truths, knowledge can arise. Learn to nd what in the mind you can rely on as a path factor that will give you the strength you need to withstand the negative factors. The ability not to get discouraged by events comes down to your ability to keep talking to yourself with the right tone of voice, saying the right things to yourself. That's what right view is all about. Remind yourself that no matter how bad things get or how long the dry stretches seem to last, it's not the end. The possibility for knowledge is always there. This is one of the amazing things about the mind. It's always aware. There's always that potential for knowledge, for understanding. Sometimes it may seem weak, but it's there, and you can encourage it. That's how, when things get bad, you can become your own best counselor, your own best advisor, so that when things crash, not everything gets demolished. Your determination not to keep on soaring. That'll see you through. Ajahn Mun talked about this in his last major sermon. The one thing you hold on to all the way through the path, he said, is the determination not to come back and be the laughingstock of the dilemmas ever again, not having to soar ever again. The Buddha calls this taking yourself as your governing principle, reminding yourself that you're soaring and that deep down inside you want to nd a way out. So discard your unnecessary baggage and hold on to the basics: consistency, discipline, appropriate attention, for those are the things that'll see you through. Endurance made easier. January 27, 2009. We're practicing to put an end to stress, soaring, and pain. But the practice itself involves stress, soaring, and pain. As the Buddha said, there are times when you realize that certain unskillful qualities in your mind are not going away as you live at your ease. So you have to be willing to put up with some pain if you want to get rid of them. In other words, we're not out pursuing pain in order to prove a point, but we use it when we need to. Recently someone claimed that people who choose the monastic path are the young men out looking for the hardest path they can nd, kind of a macho masochism. But that's not the case at all. You don't look for pain any more than you have to, but you realize that there are times when if you don't put up with some pain or stress, then greed, anger, and delusion aren't going to vacate your mind. The image the Buddha gives is of an etcher, someone who makes arrows. The etcher has to straighten the arrow shaft by running it next to an aim. As long as the shaft isn't straight yet, he has to keep running it next to the aim, rst this side, then that side. Once the shaft is straightened, though, he doesn't need to run it against the aim anymore. In the same way, our practice is not necessarily heading into pain, but straightening out the mind is going to involve running alongside some pain, so that we can ultimately get beyond the pain. This is why the Buddha began the Avaddhapadamaka, one of his RST major summaries of the path, by saying that patient endurance is the utmost austerity. Back in his time there were people who practiced austerities to burn away their dilemmas. But as the Buddha pointed out, the particular type of physical austerity didn't matter, such as standing on one leg out in the sun, lying down on a bed of nails, or whatever. What mattered was learning how to develop the quality of endurance in the mind. That's what burns away dilemma. So we're after a mental quality, a quality that can live with pain and not get upset by it. The comparison the Buddha gave is of an elephant going into battle. If the elephant has been trained, then no matter what horrible sights or sounds or smells or tastes or tactile sensations it encounters in the battle, it's not deterred. No matter what enticing sights, sounds, smells, tastes, or tactile sensations, it's not swayed. That's the kind of quality you want to develop in the practice. It's not going to be easy, but you can make it easier. if you know how to approach it. The RST step is to focus on the mind. To what extent is the mind making it harder to endure these things? The Buddha gives the example of a person shot by an arrow. And being shot by one arrow isn't enough. He shoots himself with more arrows. The RST arrow is the actual pain, the extra arrows are all his mental ailing around in reaction to the pain. These extra arrows are the problem. As Ajahn Fuang once said, if physical pain isn't killing you, you can take it. But for most of us, the problem isn't so much the physical pain. It's all that extra zuring that we add on top of it, all the extra arrows we shoot into the mind. So you want to keep looking into the mind. What are these extra arrows? And how can you prevent yourself from shooting them? One way is to develop a good sense of humor around the whole situation. I don't know the Pali word for humor, but you see examples of it in the canon, where the Buddha talks about the conditions for aroused ear, as opposed to the conditions for laziness. The external conditions are the same in either case. If you haven't eaten enough, you sit there complaining, I can't practice today. I have no energy. I'm feeling hungry. I'm feeling tired and weak. That's a condition for laziness. The condition for aroused ear, if you haven't eaten enough, is to say, the body is light. I don't have to worry about digesting my food today. I'm not sleepy or drowsy or weighed down by the food. And in the way the Buddha expresses each pair of cases, there's a humor to the whole sutta. That's one thing. Learning how to maintain good humor around the practice. You may have heard the story of the 19th century Englishman who went across northern Canada with a group of Dean Indians. He noticed that on the days when they couldn't eat any food, the Dean tended to joke and laugh the most. That's how they were able to keep up their spirits. The same with the passage in Slaughterhouse 5 where the American prisoner of war visits the section of the prisoner of war camp where the British troops are being held. The British troops are all very organized, they're putting on comedy sketches, they're basically having a good time. They're zuring a lot less than the Americans, who just sit around moping over their individual zurings, plotting revenge on one another. The British troops are actively determined to keep up their spirits as much as possible in the face of a very difficult situation. So try to develop that attitude as you practice. This is why adjusting the breath is sometimes called playing with the breath. If you're sitting with pain, ask yourself, what can the breath do that I've never had it do before? And think of the breath in different ways you've never thought of before, coming in and out different parts of the body, running in different ways through the body, connecting up in different ways. See what you can do to keep yourself entertained with the breath, to gladden the mind. Become more proactive toward the pain, investigate it, be curious about it, instead of just passively soaring from it. Keeping a good humor helps to put you in a position of power. That's one attitude to ease the burden of endurance. The second is to have an attitude of innate goodwill. Many of the Buddha's teachings on endurance make this point. After he was wounded by Devadatta, with a stone sliver in his foot, the pain was excruciating. So he went to lie down. Mara came up to taunt him, "Are you moping? Are you drunk? Are you a lazybones? What's your problem here?" The Buddha replied, "I'm not moping, lazy, or drunk. I'm not in a stupor. I lie down with sympathy for all beings. That's what minimizes the pain." Developing a sense of goodwill for everybody, even those who may have injured you. You realize that you're not the only person in the world who's suffering, and you wish no one any ill. That helps to lighten your pain. The third attitude is to depersonalize the situation. Your ability to step back from the situation and not put it into a narrative where you're the victim, the person who's suffering. Think of the passage where the Buddha describes the different ways that people can speak to you. They can speak in timely or untimely ways. They can speak with good intentions or bad intentions, say words that are true or false on down the line. These are the kinds of speech that exist in the human world. So when something unpleasant is said to you, analyze it. Ask yourself, were those words timely or untimely? True or false? Beneficial or harmful? by analyzing the words. In these impersonal terms, you pull yourself out of the narrative. Remind yourself, this is the human condition. Unpleasant, nasty words are nothing unheard of. They're happening to people all around the world all the time. As the Buddha says, when people have wronged you, have wronged someone you love, or have done good things for someone you hate, keep reminding yourself, what else should I expect? This is the human condition. Put things into the larger perspective. You can pull yourself out of the condition of being the victim simply by learning how to analyze things. In impersonal terms, there's a great passage in the canon where Ven. Sariputta says, if someone says something really hurtful, tell yourself, an unpleasant sound has made contact at the ear. We usually don't think in those terms. We think, why is that person saying that to me? How outrageous can you get? We create a narrative that lays more suffering on the mind. The next time someone says something really unpleasant, remind yourself, an unpleasant sound has made contact at the ear. That depersonalizes it, pulls you out of it, stops you from shooting yourself with arrows. Then, as the Buddha says, spread thoughts of goodwill to all beings starting with the person who's harmed you. Keep spreading those thoughts to include everyone, including yourself. All of this applies to the physical pain that comes up in the meditation as well. Part of the mind says, why am I doing this? Why am I torturing myself? Look at that thought simply as a thought arising and passing away. Look at the pain simply as momentary sensations arising and passing away. Analyze the thoughts as events. Then remind yourself, if you're sitting here moaning and groaning about the pain, you're not really showing goodwill for yourself. Goodwill for yourself means learning how to pull yourself out of this suffering. Learning how not to identify with it, not to glamorize it, not to romanticize it, not to insist on your right to suffer. You're here to end a way around it. The suffering we're trying to gain release from is the suffering caused by the mind. As Ajahn Lee says, there are two kinds of suffering. The suffering of natural causes, which comes from the conditioned nature of things, and unnatural suffering, which comes from craving. And often our craving manifests itself as the narratives we want to tell ourselves about whatever's happening. So the trick to developing endurance is to learn to look at what the mind is doing. Learning how to sit with pain is often a good way of seeing what's happening in the mind. That old image of the watering hole out in the savannah is good to keep in mind. If you want to survey the animals in the savannah or take a picture or make a documentary of the animals in the savannah, you don't go wandering around the savannah. They'll hide from you. You go to the watering hole. Any animal in the area will have to come to the watering hole at some point during the day or the night. That's when you can observe and take pictures and make your documentary. It's the same with the mind. When there's pain and you're sitting with it, watching it from the point of view of the breath, all the unskillful little animals in your mind are going to come up at some point, and you're in a great position to observe them. You say, this is what anger is like. This is how it comes, this is how it goes. This is how the victim comes, this is how the victim goes. This is how the whining member of the committee comes, how it goes. You get to see them all. And as you see them, you learn how not to identify with them. Try to develop that sense of humor, that ability to pull yourself out of the narrative simply by analyzing what's going on in impersonal terms. Develop goodwill for all beings. When personal terms do come up, develop that sense of goodwill for all, as the Buddha says, with a mind like earth. Again, he's got that humorous story of the man who comes along and tries to dig at the earth and spit on the earth and urinate on the earth, saying, be without earth, be without earth. But of course the man is never going to succeed in making the earth be without earth, because earth is so large. You want to make your mind that large, so that no pain physical or mental can have an impact with its piddling urine and spit. Humor, innate goodwill, and the ability to see things in impersonal terms. These are the strategies for keeping yourself from shooting those extra arrows. These are the strategies for helping your endurance become less of a burden and turn into something stable, lasting, and strong. Thinking your way to stillness. January 8, 2009. There's a common perception that meditation doesn't involve any thinking. You just force the mind to stay alert in the present moment and refuse to get involved in any thoughts at all. Then it will settle down. That approach works for some people in some circumstances, but not for everyone. This is why the Buddha gave a wide range of instructions on how to deal with distracting thoughts. Just noting them and dropping them is one way of dealing with them, but there are other ways of dealing with them as well, many of which require that you think in order to get around them. So it's important to know how to use your thinking processes as a part of the meditation. One method that Ajahn Lee recommends is to think about the breath, and think about how you think about the breath. He talks about the breath energy throughout the whole body, and how the breath can be good or bad for you. He also talks about how to explore the different manifestations of breath energy in the body, how to experiment with different ways of perceiving them. In other words, get yourself interested in the breath, interested in how you relate to the energy in the body. As you explore that, as you think about it and analyze it and watch it, the mind drops its other interests, objects, and preoccupations, and gets absorbed through the process of analysis. This is one of the bases of success, vimansa. Concentration based on analysis. But there are times when the mind will refuse to settle down with the breath. It's got other issues. So there are different ways of dealing with those issues. First, you've got to figure out what the issues are. If the mind seems restless, what is it restless about? What is it stirred up? Sometimes the agenda lies under the surface. One way to bring it up into the light of day is to refuse to think about whatever the issue is, and see what part of the mind complains, saying, "This is important, you've got to think about this." And you can ask it, why? Listen to what it has to say, both in terms of the content and in the terms of the tone of voice. Look into the assumptions on which that complaint is based. Then analyze the assumptions to disentangle yourself from them. You might ask yourself who in your past thought that way, spoke that way. Someone whose ideas and attitudes you picked up, often without questioning. We've picked up lots of unhealthy attitudes from our parents, from our teachers, from our friends, from the media, and they keep sloshing around in the mind. Ajahn Lee talks about the fact that you have germs in your bloodstream, and they're going through your brain. Maybe the thoughts going through your brain are their thoughts. Even if you don't resonate with the idea of germs in your brain having thoughts, the same basic principle applies to the people in your background. Their thoughts have somehow gotten planted in your brain. The fact that the thoughts are planted in your brain isn't your responsibility right now, but it is your responsibility if you take them up and chew on them. You have to dissociate yourself from that kind of thinking, to ask, what are the assumptions behind those thoughts? Do you really believe them? Learn how to look at them from the outside. I had the advantage, when I was learning how to meditate in Thailand, that when I'd bring an issue up with Ajahn Fuang, he'd sometimes give me a quizzical look. He had never heard any thinking like that before. And just the fact that he regarded as strange the thoughts I regarded as natural helped me realize how much I was a product of my culture, of a particular set of circumstances at a particular time, in a particular place. And it's a really good exercise to learn to question your background, the ideas you were brought up with, the assumptions you carry around. If these things are not questioned, they'll simply lurk there and eat away at your mind and get in the way of the practice. It may turn out that, after investigating these ideas, you decide that they are useful at certain times in certain places, but not always. And especially not if they're interfering with your meditation. You have to see that they're not really appropriate for what you're doing right now. That's one way of dealing with thoughts like that. Another is simply to look at what the thoughts are doing to the mind. If you allow the mind to think in these ways over and over again, you're creating mental ruts. Are those ruts that you want? Do you want your mind to keep lurching back into those ideas again and again and again? As the ruts get deeper and deeper, it gets harder and harder to get out. This is called looking at the drawbacks of that particular thought. Another way of dealing with these thoughts is to actively replace them with the opposite thought. This is what the recollections taught by the Buddha are useful for. If you're feeling discouraged in your practice, you can think about all the members of the noble Sangha who went through really miserable times in their practice for one reason or another, either outside hardships or just their own inability to get the mind concentrated. There's the story of one monk who decided to commit suicide. He had been practicing for more than 20 years. As he said, he hadn't had even a gursnap's worth of concentration. So he got the razor and everything all ready. And that's when he came to his senses. His mind suddenly gathered into one and settled down. As for us, we haven't gotten suicidal in our practice yet, and I dare say that we've had more than a few gursnaps worth of concentration. So you can take comfort from the fact that if he could do it, you can do it. There's no need to get discouraged. You can also think about the noble Sangha when outside circumstances get tough. There are verses in the Therigatha about monks who fall sick out in the wilderness. They have no doctor, no medicine. So what do? They resolve to develop the factors for awakening, the V strengths, the V faculties, 4 bases of success, and to use those qualities as their medicine. There's also a set of verses about a monk who doesn't get any alms. He asks himself, "What are you going to do?" And his answer is, "I'm going to go back to my dwelling and I'm going to meditate. It's cold outside, what are you going to do?" "I'm going to use the 4 immeasurable meditations: limitless goodwill, limitless compassion, limitless empathetic joy, limitless equanimity to warm the heart." These reactions remind you that when things get difficult, you want to develop the mind's resources so that you don't just keep obsessing about the difficulties and complaining about how they make it impossible to practice. There have been people in the past who have been in worse situations than you're in, but they were able to practice in spite of that fact. In other words, you learn how to think in positive ways, helpful ways, instead of destroying yourself with your thoughts. There are also reactions on your generosity, on your virtue, on the fact that you've developed the qualities that make people into divas. Those are to remind you that you do have worth, that you do have potential in the meditation. These are some of the ways in which thinking is useful in the meditation. You analyze unskillful thinking and you try to replace it with skillful thinking. As the Buddha said, once the mind has settled down with the skillful thinking, you can then bring it back to the breath, bring it back to contemplation of the body, whatever your frame of reference, so that you can deepen the concentration. In Ajahn Mahabua's analogy, this is like trying to cut down a tree in the middle of a forest. If the tree were out in an open meadow, there'd be no problem cutting it down. You'd simply decide which direction you wanted it to go, and you'd cut it to fall in that direction. But in the forest you have to deal with all the branches that are entangled with the branches of the other trees. You have to cut them rst before you can bring the tree down. In other words, if you nd that your thoughts are entangling you with the world, you've got to learn how to think in ways that help disentangle you, that cut the intertwining branches, whether through seeing the negative side of the thoughts that are pulling you away, or actively replacing those negative thoughts with positive thoughts that incline the mind to see the value of the practice, to really feel the value of the practice, and to give you confidence in your ability to do the practice. Today I asked several people about which stories about the Buddha's life they found most inspiring when they needed confidence and inspiration in the practice. And it was interesting to see how widely the stories varied. Some people were inspired by the Buddha's physical courage. Some were more inspired by his restraint as a teacher. Some were inspired by his psychic powers, his ability to deal with devas, brahmas, and mara. Some were more inspired by his ability to deal with simple people. There's a great passage in the Therigatha where an outcast person talks about his life. His job was to gather the old wilted ores at shrines and throw them away, one of the lowliest occupations in India at that time. One day the Buddha comes up and simply stands in front of him. The guy tries to attune himself against the wall behind him to get out of the Buddha's way, but then he begins to realize that that's not why the Buddha's standing there. The Buddha wants to teach him. The Buddha takes on this outcast as a student and teaches him to be an arahant. There are lots of ways you can end the inspiration in the life of the Buddha. You have to decide for yourself which story or incident you end most inspiring. The same with the Dhamma. The same with the Sangha. There are lots of possibilities there. This is one way in which reading the Dhamma is useful. There's a tendency among some meditators to believe that reading gets in the way of your meditation. But reading about good examples reminds you that human beings can do this. There are human beings who have succeeded in the practice. There have been in the past and there can still be in the present moment. There's a tendency in modern literature to focus on anti-heroes. People whose virtue lies in their being frank about their weaknesses, which is a kind of virtue, but not the whole story of virtue. For the sake of the practice, it's more useful to read about people who have succeeded in doing what's difficult. There are friends from the past. One of the definitions of true friends is that they give what is hard to give, do what is hard to do, sacrifice what is hard to sacrifice. They did that for us, not just for us personally, but for everybody in the future. There's that great story about Ven. Mahakassapa. Toward the end of his life, the Buddha calls in Mahakassapa and says, "Look, you've been living out in the wilderness, living meager alms. You don't really need to do this anymore. You're an arahant now. Come and stay near me. Live a more comfortable life." Mahakassapa says, "No, I've been doing this all along, praising this order of life. I want to keep this up as an example for the generations to come." In other words, he did that for us. So think about that when things get difficult. There are people in the past who wanted to encourage us, wanted to see us get the same results from the practice that they got. Take heart from that. Only when you learn how to think skillfully in this way can you get the mind to a point where it's willing to stop thinking. So, remember, not all thinking is bad. Not all fabrication is bad. You have to learn how to fabricate skillfully before you can let go of fabrication, and these are some of the ways you can do it. Acceptance. October 31, 2008. As with so many other issues, the Buddha took a middle road when it came to the issue of other power and self-power on the path. On the one hand, there's the famous passage where Ven. Ananda comes to see the Buddha and exclaims that having admirable friends is half of the practice, half of the holy life, and the Buddha says, "Don't say that, Ananda. Having admirable friends is the whole of the holy life." And the Buddha gives himself as an example, saying, "Without me as your admirable friend, you wouldn't be practicing the Noble Eightfold Path." Notice that he doesn't say, "I'm doing it for you." He says, "I'm an outside condition." He makes it possible for you to practice. If we didn't have the Buddha, if we didn't have the Dhamma to point the way to us, where would we be right now? We wouldn't be here meditating, that's for sure. We'd be someplace else doing who knows what. At the same time, though, there's also the passage where the Buddha says, "It's up to you to follow the path, the Tathagatas only point the way." Or the passage where a man comes to see the Buddha and says, "Why is it that when you teach the path to people, they don't all arrive at the goal?" Implying that there's something wrong with the Buddha as a teacher. So the Buddha responds, "Have you ever given directions to people to follow the road to Rahagaha?" The man says, "Yes." Do they all get to Rahagaha? Well, some people follow the directions and they get there, but others don't, and they end up way out west. That's something I can't take responsibility for. The Buddha then says that, in the same way, he can't take responsibility for the fact that some people follow his instructions and achieve the noble attainments, while other people don't follow them. In other words, it's up to each of us to actually put the teachings into practice so that we can get the results. The Dhamma we're trying to attain is something that's going to be found inside the heart. The Dhamma we're listening to right now is pointing to that Dhamma. That's why the word for Dhamma talk Dhammadasana literally means pointing to the Dhamma. These words are not the Dhamma. The words point to a possible attainment inside your heart, to the potentials that are inside your heart. It's up to you to develop them. The problem, of course, is that there are many yas in there, lots of different potentials, lots of different opinions and intentions, lots of different goals. And the mind moves from one to another. When you sit down to meditate, part of the mind is with the program, and part of the mind is not, which can be the cause for a lot of frustration. But you can learn how to use these many selves to your advantage. Remember, each of your selves is the result of an activity aimed at happiness. We self is a verb. We're engaged in self-ng. If we had one set self, we'd be stuck there. That would be our nature, and we wouldn't be able to change it. Any changes would have to come from outside. But fortunately we're not stuck with one self. We have lots of different selves, formed around lots of different activities aimed at happiness. If we use these selves properly, they can help one another along. They can provide a perspective on one another, so that what one self doesn't see, another self can see. What one self can't do, another self can. So it's important that we learn to get all of these different selves working together. This is why the Buddha focuses so much attention on the issue of happiness, because all of our activities, all our selves, are aimed at happiness in one form or another. They have different understandings of what it might be, different strategies for how to get there, but they're all aimed at the same place. A large part of the practice is learning how to get them to work together to understand where true happiness can be found. You're going to encounter this a lot as you meditate. You're sitting here with the breath, and suddenly there's an impulse to go someplace else. You have to examine the impulse, learn how to say no, and learn how to make the no stick. Sometimes you can do that simply by noticing, oh, here comes an impulse heading in the wrong direction, and the impulse drops away. You're back with the breath. No problem. Other times the impulse to go goes deeper than that. It's based on a really deep misunderstanding about where happiness can be found. In cases like that, you have to reason with the mind. You've got an old habit that may have worked in some circumstances in the past, but it's not appropriate right now. This is why concentration requires some discernment. As the Buddha once said, there's no jhana without discernment. To get the mind to settle down, you have to reason with the obstreperous parts that want to go someplace else, to think about other things, plan other things. You have to reason with that particular set of selves to show them that their notions don't really lead to any true happiness, and you're all better coming back. As you get of these different distractions, you end yourself going deeper and deeper into a lot of the mind's misunderstandings. This is how concentration gives rise to insight. Or as the Buddha said, there's no discernment without jhana. The two qualities go together, they depend on each other. So we get good instructions, hear the Dhamma, see the Dhamma practiced in a way that's an inspiring example. That's the kind of help we get from outside. As for inside, we have to develop the conviction that we can do it and that it's really worth doing. This is where the Buddha's teachings on acceptance come in. Often we hear that a central part of practice is radical acceptance. Learning how to accept who you are, just as you are, and it's all okay. But that's making a lot of assumptions right there. That there is a who you are, that you are a certain way, that you're going to stay that certain way, and it's all right to stay that certain way, all of which totally goes against what the Buddha had to teach. To begin with, he didn't say that you are a certain way, or that you're stuck there. The question of who you are is something he put aside. He has you focus instead on what you do. And what are you doing? Is it skillful or is it not? If it's not skillful, then 1. You've got to admit the fact that it's not skillful, and 2. Accept the fact you could make your behavior more skillful. This is the part of acceptance that many of us resist. We may not be happy where we are, but for some reason we resist changing. This is the way I am, and this is the way I'm going to stay. That kind of stubborn acceptance the Buddha doesn't encourage at all. Or, this is the way I do things, and I'm going to keep on doing them this way. That's a form of clinging to habits and practices, and it's a cause of suffering. What the Buddha wants us to accept is the fact that our actions are causing suffering, but we don't have to keep acting in those ways. We have the potential to change. Many of us resist that. Even though we know we're suffering, for some reason we don't want to change. We disempower ourselves. The RST step in regaining some of that power is to have the conviction that, yes, the Buddha did gain awakening through his own efforts, and, yes, he did it through developing qualities of mind that we have in a potential form, and that we can develop too. That conviction is meant to be a challenge. Are you going to live your life without examining these possibilities, without trying to develop these qualities? If so, you're missing out on a really important opportunity. That's what true acceptance is. You accept the challenge, for you see that the alternative is continued suering. You can also see the Buddha's position on acceptance in the V things he has us react on, day in and day out. The RST4R. I am subject to aging, subject to illness, subject to death, subject to separation from all that is dear and appealing to me. That's accepting the fact of suering in its various forms. And it's not just you, not just me. Everybody is subject to these things. But then the FTH thing he has us accept is that we're the owners of our actions, heir to our actions, born of our actions, related through our actions, and have our actions as our arbitrators. Whatever we do, for good or for evil, to that will we fall heir. In other words, what we're experiencing in the present is the result of our actions, past and present, and what we'll experience in the future is also a result of our actions. So what we're experiencing and are going to experience is up to us. We have to accept responsibility. There is suering, we are responsible for the suering that has happened, but we also have the potential not to suer. That's another part of conviction, another part of the type of acceptance the Buddha has us develop. Not just accepting where we are, but accepting that we bear responsibility for where we are. When we have the responsibility, we have the power to change. Again, some of us resist that. But where does that resistance lead us? It keeps us stuck in suering. So too. Get out of that suering, you develop conviction that awakening is possible, and it can be found through developing qualities you already have. That leads to the next strength, the next empowerment, which is persistence, energy, the effort we put into the practice. We realize that we can do this, and we don't have much time, so we'd better get right to it. And stick with it. We practice when we feel like practicing, and we also practice when we don't. We can't let our moods be in charge. If we don't follow the path now, who knows when we're going to be able to follow it? It doesn't get easier with age, you know. And nobody else can do it for us. Other people can point out the way, other people can inspire us with their example, but if we're going to see the results, we have to do the actions. We have to train the mind, train our intentions. This takes time, so we have to stick with it. This leads to the third strength, or the third empowerment, which is mindfulness. The ability to keep these facts in mind. You keep reminding yourself, regardless of what you want to do, this is the way things are. If you don't work at the practice now, you may not have the time in the future. So you've got to remember to keep working at it now, keep at it now, keep at it now. Fortunately, it's not all work, not all strenuous effort. If you're mindful and alert as you try to develop skillful qualities and let go of unskillful ones, the mind comes to concentration. And concentration is characterized by pleasure, rapture, equanimity, a strong sense of well-being. This is what gives us energy on the path. When the Buddha gives analogies for the different factors of the path, he often compares concentration to food. We feed on rapture, he says, like the radiant gods. Or when he compares our practice to a frontier fortress, he compares right concentration to the different stores of foods that keep the soldiers strong and well-nourished. The pleasure of the concentration becomes a form of strength you can develop inside. Based on that strength, you can strengthen your discernment, for the stillness and satisfaction of concentration enable you to perform the duties of discernment, starting with the ability to see clearly where suering is arising and what's arising with it. You notice, what are you doing when there's suering in the mind? When the suering goes, what did you just do? What did you stop doing? What did you just change? You can see suering arising and passing away, but more importantly, you can see its causes arising and passing away. That way you understand. This understanding is what allows you to cut through the causes with more and more precision, to get more skillful at all the duties of the Four Noble Truths. When you're really skilled at these things, dropping the obsessions that cause suffering, the mind grows lighter and lighter. It's unburdened. You don't have to waste your energy carrying the weight of suffering around. These are all strengths we can develop within, a kind of inner power we can develop once we know the path and are convinced that it can be done and that we can do it. So it's important to accept that we have these potentials, that whatever way we behave, if it's unskillful, it can be changed. As the Buddha once said, if it weren't possible to abandon unskillful actions and to develop skillful ones, he wouldn't teach us to do these things. But it is possible. This is why he has you focus on the issue of action, what you can do as opposed to what you are, or what you can do now, as opposed to what you've habitually been doing in the past. Habits can be changed. If you find yourself resisting that fact, you have to ask yourself why. Is it from laziness? From pride? And why do we engage in laziness? Why do we engage in pride? What do we get out of it? What do we gain? These things may make us feel good in the present moment, but do they really make us happy? Do they really lead to well-being? You have to see that every action you take, every choice you make, is made for the purpose of happiness. But often it's misdirected, ill-advised. And so, given that every you is aimed at happiness, the wiser yous can reason strategically with the unskillful yous until you win them over. That's the kind of internal work we all have to do. This is how we take advantage of all our many selves. Accept that we have these good potentials. And accept the fact that if we don't develop them, we're going to keep on suffering. So when we talk about acceptance in the Buddha's teachings, it's not simply accepting what you are. The Buddha has you accept where you are, i.e., you're stuck in suffering but you don't have to stay there. Accept that you have the potential to go beyond suffering through training your actions, training your intentions, training the mind. We have the Buddha and his Sangha of noble disciples as our examples. We have the Dhamma as our guide. That's the outside help, the outside power. The inside power is the determination we can generate from within as we follow their example, as we bring our actions in line with the guidance provided by the Dhamma, practicing the Dhamma in line with the Dhamma. This is the teaching that's stressed over and over again in the forest tradition. You don't change the Dhamma to suit yourself, you change yourself to tea with the Dhamma, i.e., you change your actions to fall in line with the Dhamma. That's how you develop your inner powers that can lead to true happiness, the happiness we all want. Parts of us may resist, but we learn how to reason with those parts, reason with those attitudes. As we do, we'll end that everything converges. All the factors of the path come together. And at that point it doesn't really matter whether it was because of outside help or inside help, i.e., our inner strength. The fact is that we've reached release and that's all that matters. So accept that that's a possibility and see where it takes you. Perfections as priorities. August 21, 2008. We sit here focused on the breath, mindful of the breath, alert. We want to make sure we're not just mindful and alert for a few breaths and then someplace else. We want to stay mindful and alert for the whole hour. And then at the end of the hour when you get up, you want to maintain that mindfulness and alertness as long as you're awake. That requires ardency, the willingness to give energy to the practice with the confidence that if you do it in the proper way, in a skillful way, and that's what ardency is all about, it's not just plain old eart, it's skillful eart. If your eart is skillful, then you gain energy in return. But you have to be willing to make the investment. That often means going through periods when the eart is not yet skillful and wondering if it's ever going to get right. This is where your determination sees you through. In fact, all of the qualities that are called paramis or perfections come into play here. The practice is not simply a matter of technique. It requires developing your heart as well as your mind. We think of the heart and mind as two separate things, but in almost all the languages where Buddhism has been practiced, the words for heart and mind tend to blur into each other. Citta in Pali is used in some cases where it means mind, and in some where it means heart. So you're not just training your mind here, you're training your heart as well. Which means that meditation is not just a matter of techniques, but also a matter of strengthening the inner qualities that allow you to give yourself to the practice in a wholehearted way, in the hopes that the whole heart and whole mind will be in tea. This is what the teachings about the perfections are all about. They focus on the qualities of the heart and mind that you need to bring to the practice and are going to get developed in the practice. They're an excellent framework for looking at the practice as a lifetime process, not simply what you do when you're on retreat. They're a way of enabling you to answer the question, what are you going to do with your life? What do you want out of your life? When you look back in your life as death is approaching, what do you want to look back on? And what do you want to take with you as a result of having lived this life? If you focus your attention simply on pleasures, you won't have anything at that point, just memories of the pleasures, which may or may not be pleasant memories. Or you may decide that you want to leave your mark, to accomplish something in the world, but that's a pretty risky proposition, because the world has its pendulum swings. The efforts you make might come just at the end of a pendulum swing that's going to turn around and wipe out everything you've done. I once listened to a lawyer who had worked his way up through the government echelons. He'd argued a lot of civil rights cases back in the era when the Supreme Court was liberal. But then he lived long enough to see the pendulum swing back and get conservative again. He lived to see many of the things he had worked for dismantled. I once went with my father to visit our old home in Charlottesville. It was a house we'd built ourselves. We had worked with the architect, got the design we wanted. And even though we hired some builders, Dad did a lot of the carpentry work. We as a family did the painting, all the things we could do to help save money in building the house. So one day, some 30 years after we had moved away, I went with my father and older brother to visit Charlottesville. As we swung by the house, we saw that the current owners weren't taking proper care of it. The roof was beginning to rot through in some spots. We drove back, dropped my brother Oa, and then it was just my dad and me. As he was driving, he said, "You know, I have nothing to show for my life." And he went through all the times he had been a farmer, spent all that time and energy growing his potatoes, and then was paid money by the government to destroy the crops to help keep up the price of potatoes. He'd gotten a job in the government and worked hard to make proposals that Congress then pork-barreled beyond recognition. And then Nally A. President came in and wiped out the council he was working on. Thinking about what he said made me realize that if you look for your accomplishments in the world outside, they can easily get erased. So if we're not here just for our own personal pleasures or to leave a mark in the world, what are we here for? Well, the teaching on the perfections points you to the mind. You want to be here to develop qualities of the mind. You may not want to be here, but here you are, so what are you going to do about it? What are you going to get out of this? There's a lot of sewering involved in being a human being, and this is one of the better planes of existence, so what will you have to show for your life? If you've worked on qualities of the mind, they carry over. They're an accomplishment that's entirely within your power. That's what we're working on here. It's good to keep that perspective in mind. The qualities may not grow as quickly as we'd like, but that's what the quality of patience is for. To learn how to stick with something even through frustration, even through difficulty. In the course of that, you may end yourself getting distracted with ideas of what else might be more pleasant. That's what the qualities of determination and truthfulness are for. In fact, determination seems to underlie all the perfections. There are 4 aspects to determination. You use your discernment to decide what you want to accomplish, to see how it best might be accomplished, and then you stick with it. To stick with it requires truthfulness, which doesn't mean just telling the truth. It means that once you've made up your mind, you really stick with what you've decided to do. You're true to yourself. You're not a traitor to yourself. That's what'll see you through. This is going to involve some renunciation and require that you develop a sense of calm within the renunciation, because there are many possible pleasures in this life. If you try to gather up all of them, you go crazy. Once a year I head up to the Bay Area, where there are still traces of the human potential movement. There's a strong sense up there that you can and should actualize your full potential as a human being by striving for excellence in all areas of your life. Becoming physically strong and healthy, mentally sharp, artistically creative, socially enlightened, sexually active, politically active, spiritually advanced. People rarely stop to consider that excellence in one area might actually cancel out or preclude excellence in another. In the back of their minds, there's always the thought, well, if I'm not happy, it's because I'm not trying hard enough in every possible direction. That's crazy making. You've got to focus on what's really worthwhile in life, which means resisting a lot of the currents in our culture, because our culture seems to be all about distraction in all directions, or as someone once put it, discursive noise. You're the one who has to focus your mind to keep it calmly centered and on course in the midst of all this. You're the one who has to decide on your goals and to realize that you'll have to give up some of the things you like in order to attain those goals. I've told you the story about the Chinese woman teaching her stepdaughter, while they were playing chess, that if you want to be happy in life, you have to decide that there's one thing you want more than anything else, and you have to be willing to sacrifice everything else for that one thing. That, of course, was a lesson the stepdaughter didn't want to hear. What she did notice, though, was that her stepmother was losing chess pieces all over the board. So she decided, well, here's my chance to beat my stepmother in chess. She started playing more aggressively, but it turned out to be a trap. The stepmother had been sacrificing her pieces strategically to lure the girl in, and then she checkmated her. Of course, the way the stepmother played chess was an illustration of the principle she was trying to teach. If you're willing to sacrifice some pawns and knights and other pieces here and there, you can win. That's how we should live our lives, realizing we can't keep all our pawns and win at the same time. We have to make our choices. There are a lot of either-ors in life. We prefer the both and sometimes not just the both and. We want the both and. But if you really want to have something to show for your life, you've got to recognize where it's strictly either or. You've got to decide that there are important qualities in the mind that have to take top priority over everything else. Priority. That's one of the possible meanings of the word parami, which is usually translated as perfection. Parami is one of those words that nobody really knows why it was chosen or what it means. It doesn't appear in any of the Buddha's own teachings, but was a later development in the tradition. One of the possible meanings of parami is related to parama, which means to be foremost. And the idea of foremost can be understood in two ways. One is that you try to become really excellent and foremost in these particular qualities of the mind, and two, you want to give them top priority, make them foremost in your life. When you're working on a job, whether or not the job succeeds, you want to be sure to develop qualities like patience, truthfulness, determination, and discernment regardless. Sometimes the success of the job may depend on factors totally beyond your control. But patience is something you can develop, determination is something you can develop regardless of outside circumstances. So remember, as you meditate, it's not just a matter of following a technique. You have to apply yourself fully. You have to give your whole heart to this. And as you give your whole heart, your heart gains wholeness. When you give questions of the wise heart top priority, the heart does become excellent. It's good to look at your life and ask yourself, what do I want to accomplish with this life? You don't know how many years you have left, but you do know you have right now. And then the next right now, and the next. So as long as the right nows are coming, use them as an opportunity to develop these qualities of the heart, because these are the things that make human life worthwhile. In keeping with the Buddha's teachings, we underscore the profound significance of disseminating wisdom extensively. Today, we've converted this voluminous 1,000-page tome into an easily accessible audio format. Now, the responsibility to further this noble cause rests with you. Through your subscriptions, likes, and content shares, you play a pivotal role in the widespread distribution of these teachings, benefiting countless others. Let's uphold the age-old tradition of sharing knowledge and fostering mindfulness for the greater good of humanity. We invite you to join us in this mission, and together, we can create a profound impact on the lives of many.